The hug lasted only 15 seconds, but it was enough for the 200 people in the grand ballroom of Monteverde Manor to understand they were witnessing a moment where truth triumphed over lies, dignity over arrogance, and humanity over power. 32-year-old Clara Miller never imagined that the strong, reassuring arms of the health minister, Dr. Richard Miller, enveloping her before an audience of tycoons and politicians, could erase in seconds all the humiliation she had suffered moments before. But to understand how we arrived at this moment of redemption, we must return to the beginning of that night, when Clara was still fighting back tears and battling the urge to simply disappear from a place where she didn't belong. Celso Ramirez's mansion rose like a monument to excess. Its Carrara marble columns reflected the light of 3 Bohemian crystal chandeliers, each worth more than Clara earned in 5 years. The mirrored floor infinitely multiplied the silhouettes of the guests, creating an illusion of grandeur that seemed to extend beyond the bounds of reality. Clara observed it all with eyes that had seen much suffering, but also much beauty in the small things of life. She shouldn't be there. Her presence at this gala dinner was an anomaly in the ordered universe of Monteverde's high society. 3 weeks earlier, she had saved the life of Mrs. Ramirez, Celso's mother, during a severe diabetic crisis. The 86-year-old woman had collapsed on the sidewalk in front of the hospital where Clara worked as a caregiver. Without hesitation, Clara administered first aid, called an ambulance, and stayed by the elderly woman's side until the paramedics arrived. Celso Ramirez, upon learning of the situation, had insisted on inviting Clara to his annual dinner. "It's the least I can do," he said on the phone, in that deep voice that commanded business empires. Clara hesitated, but eventually accepted. Now, standing in the middle of that opulent ballroom, wearing her only formal dress, a simple navy blue bought from a department store 2 years ago, she felt like an intruder in a world that spoke a language she didn't understand. The other guests moved like pieces in a choreographed ballet. The women, dazzling in their designer dresses, moved with the artificial grace of those who had learned from childhood to occupy such spaces. The men, impeccable in their bespoke tuxedos, gestured with the confidence of those born to command. Clara observed all this with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, feeling simultaneously invisible and excessively visible. She remembered her childhood in the outskirts of Monteverde, where houses were small and dreams, paradoxically, immense. Her mother, Mrs. Nuza, had worked as a domestic in houses like this one. Clara used to accompany her during school holidays, playing silently in the backyards of mansions while her mother waxed floors and folded clothes. Even as a child, she noticed how her mother became almost invisible to her employers, as if she were part of the furniture. "My daughter," Mrs. Nuza would say during the long bus rides back home, "you will study. You will be someone in life. You won't have to clean other people's houses." Clara had studied, graduated as a nurse, and specialized in palliative care. But there she was, surrounded by the same invisibility that had enveloped her mother decades ago. Dinner was served with military precision. Uniformed waiters circulated with dishes that looked like works of art, wines that cost more than Clara's monthly rent, and conversations that danced between business, politics, and social gossip. Clara ate in silence, responding politely when someone addressed her, but remaining on the periphery of the conversations. Then Celso Ramirez stood up, lightly tapping his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The musical tinkle silenced the room instantly. He smiled, that smile that had won millions in contracts and influential hearts. "My dear friends," he began, his voice echoing through the hall, "before we proceed with our wonderful evening, I'd like to share with you a little curiosity." His eyes fell on Clara, who felt her stomach clench. "We have a very special guest with us. Clara, please stand up." Clara hesitated. All heads turned to her. Slowly, she stood up, her legs trembling. her face burning with anticipated shame. "Clara, here," Celso continued, his voice taking on a condescending tone that Clara immediately recognized, "works taking care of sick people. Just imagine, she spends the whole day cleaning wounds, changing diapers, comforting people who are, well, not exactly at their best." A low chuckle rippled through the room. "I thought it would be interesting for you to hear a little about what that life is like. After all, we here are so far removed from that reality." Clara felt the world crumble around her. Each word from Celso was a sharp blade, cutting her dignity into small pieces. She could see on the guests' faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and barely disguised contempt. Some whispered among themselves, others watched her as if she were an exotic animal in a zoo. "So, Clara," Celso said, his smile widening, "tell us, what's it like being poor and working caring for people for minimum wage? It must be challenging." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara felt 200 pairs of eyes on her, waiting for her reaction. She could feel tears forming, but she refused to cry in front of those people. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Slowly, she lifted her head and looked directly at Celso. When she spoke, her voice came out clear and firm, carrying a dignity that no humiliation could steal. "It's difficult, sir," she said, each word heavy with truth, "but at least I can sleep peacefully with what I do." The simplicity of the answer caught Celso off guard. He had expected tears, despair, perhaps anger. He hadn't expected that devastating serenity. Several guests nervously chuckled, but most remained silent, sensing a shift in the room's atmosphere. Clara was about to sit when the double doors of the ballroom swung open. A tall, imposing man entered, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Dr. Richard Miller, the Minister of Health, was a well-known figure throughout the country. Tall, with perfectly groomed graying hair and eyes that seemed to bear the weight of decisions affecting millions of lives, he radiated a natural authority that caused the entire room to straighten up. Celso immediately stepped forward to greet him. "Minister, what an honor to have you here with us. We've been expecting your arrival." But Dr. Miller barely glanced at Celso. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Clara, who was still standing, trembling slightly. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The minister's face transformed, shifting from official composure to a deep, genuine emotion. "Clara," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "My dear Clara." Clara stared at him, confused. There was something familiar about his face, but she couldn't place it. The minister began walking toward her, weaving between the tables, completely ignoring the astonished guests. As he approached, Clara finally recognized him. The man before her was Richard Miller, yes, but he was also the husband of Mrs. Helena, the patient she had cared for 2 years prior. Mrs. Helena, who suffered from terminal cancer and had spent her last months under Clara's care. Richard Miller, who at the time was just a respected doctor, not yet a minister, and whom she had only met briefly during a few visits. Without a word, Dr. Miller opened his arms and embraced Clara in a strong, warm hug. Clara felt protected for the first time that interminable night. She could hear the murmurs of confusion from the guests, but at that moment, nothing else mattered. When they finally separated, Dr. Miller kept his hands on Clara's shoulders and turned to the silent ballroom. His voice, when he spoke, carried an authority that silenced everyone present instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "allow me to introduce one of the most important women in my life." His voice echoed through the hall like a gentle thunder. "This is Clara Miller. She cared for my wife, Helena, during her final months. She held Helena's hand when the pain was unbearable. She comforted her when fear took over. She was the last person Helena saw before she closed her eyes forever." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Not even the tinkling of the chandelier's crystals broke the solemn quiet. But that's not all, Dr. Miller continued, his voice gaining intensity. Clara also cared for my daughter Isadora during that terrible period. Isadora was only 16 and was falling apart watching her mother wither away. Clara embraced her, comforted her, helped her find the strength to carry on. It was because of Clara's compassion and wisdom that my daughter began to smile again. He paused, allowing the words to settle on the audience like rain on dry earth. This woman, he said, his voice now filled with emotion, who just minutes ago was humiliated for her social standing, is nobler than many of us here. She possesses something that money can never buy: the ability to love unconditionally, to care without expecting reward, to maintain dignity even when the world conspires against her. Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but now they were tears of relief, of recognition, of a validation she had waited her whole life for without even knowing she needed. Dr. Miller turned to Celso, who was pale and visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Ramirez," he said, his voice taking on an icy tone, "I hope you understand the privilege it was to have Clara in your home tonight. She is a national treasure, one of the people who make this country a better place to live." Celso tried to mask his discomfort with a forced smile. "Minister, of course I recognize the importance of Clara's work. Just what?" Dr. Miller interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "Just thought it would be fun to humiliate a woman who dedicates her life to caring for others? Just thought she didn't deserve the same respect you show your wealthier guests?" The silence that followed was mortifying. Clara could see press photographers who had been invited to document the social event, capturing every moment. Flashes went off discreetly, immortalizing the scene. Dr. Miller turned back to Clara. "My dear," he said, "I want you to know that Helena spoke of you until the very end. She said you were her guardian angel, that God had sent you to make her passing easier. She died in peace because she knew you would be there to care for our daughter." Clara couldn't stop crying. 2 decades of silent work, of anonymous care, of love given without expectation of return, were finally being recognized. In the weeks that followed, Clara's life changed completely. The photo of her being embraced by the minister went viral on social media with the caption, "Humility that silences power." Newspapers across the country covered the story. Clara was interviewed on television programs, invited to speak at universities and hospitals, and honored by healthcare professional associations. But with recognition came a responsibility she had never imagined. Clara discovered that her story had deeply touched ordinary people, those who, like her, worked in silence, caring, serving, loving without recognition. She began receiving letters from caregivers, nurses, cleaning assistants, all telling their own stories of dignity preserved amidst social invisibility. It was then that Clara realized that her true vocation went beyond individual care. She had a voice that could speak for the invisible, for those who serve unseen. She began giving lectures on the importance of caregivers, advocating for better working conditions for healthcare professionals, and fighting for social recognition for those who dedicate their lives to the well-being of others. Non-governmental organizations sought her out to be the spokesperson for national campaigns. Universities invited her to speak on ethics and care. Hospitals honored her as a symbol of humanitarian vocation. Clara, who had spent her life caring for others, was now championing a greater cause: the dignity of caregivers. Celso Ramirez, on the other hand, saw his life crumble gradually but inexorably. The image of him humiliating Clara had gone viral, but not in the way he'd hoped. Memes circulated on social media, companies began questioning his social responsibility practices, and contracts were canceled. For the first time in his life, Celso discovered that there were consequences that money couldn't buy or silence. 6 months after the fateful dinner, Celso was in his office, watching the city he had dominated for decades from his window.
His business empire hadn't completely collapsed, but it was significantly shaken. More than that, he had lost something he never knew he possessed, the respect of the people who truly mattered. That's when he saw an interview with Clara on television. She was at a hospital, surrounded by nurses and caregivers, talking about the importance of empathy and care. When the interviewer asked about what had happened at Celso's manor, Clara responded with a serenity that left him speechless. "What Mr. Ramirez did that night says more about him," she said, looking directly into the camera. "He acted from a place of insecurity, from a need to feel superior. I understand that. We all at some point try to feel bigger by diminishing others. But I choose to forgive. I choose not to carry anger or resentment, because my strength doesn't come from the approval of others. It comes from something he'll never understand. Genuine love for my neighbor." Celso turned off the television and sat in his leather armchair.
For the first time in decades, he wondered who he really was. Without the artifice of power, without the armor of money, without the protection of social standing, who was Celso Ramirez? The answer frightened him. He was an empty man who had built an entire life trying to impress people who, deep down, didn't care about him. He had accumulated wealth, power, influence, but he had never felt the deep satisfaction he saw in Clara's eyes in that interview. A few months later, the stories about caregivers and the importance of their work continued to be shared, inspiring a new generation of people to value not only what we do, but how we do it. Clara's journey became a symbol of how true nobility doesn't come from titles or money, but from the ability to love and serve with dignity. Clara continued her work, but now with a larger platform. She never forgot her origins, never lost the simplicity that defined her. Even when speaking to packed auditoriums, she maintained the same humility and authenticity she had shown that difficult night at Celso's manor. In one of her last interviews, Clara was asked what message she would like to leave for people who feel invisible, forgotten, undervalued. She smiled with that same serenity that had won the hearts of the entire country. "I would say that a person's worth is never determined by how others see them," she replied. "Your worth comes from the love you put into the world, the kindness you offer, the difference you make in other people's lives. It doesn't matter if no one is watching, it doesn't matter if no one is applauding. What matters is that you choose to be good, choose to care, choose to love. And that no one can take away from you." Celso Ramirez's party had ended in that unique way, but Clara's story was just beginning. She had discovered that her true vocation was not only to care for individuals, but to care for an entire category of people who, like her, had been forgotten by society. What began as a night of humiliation transformed into a movement of recognition and dignity. Clara had proven that sometimes all a person needs is someone who truly sees them, who recognizes their value, who validates their existence. And so, in that marble manor in Monteverde, where luxury had tried to overshadow humanity, the brightest light that night didn't come from any crystal chandelier, but from the heart of a woman who had chosen to love, care, and forgive. Clara had discovered that her true wealth wasn't in what she possessed, but in what she was capable of giving. And that was a wealth that no humiliation could diminish, no power could buy, and no time could destroy. The 15-second hug had changed everything. But what truly transformed that night, and all the nights that followed, was Clara's choice to keep her dignity intact, regardless of how the world chose to treat her. She had learned that true victory isn't in humiliating those who humiliate us, but in continuing to be who we are, with all the integrity and love we carry within us. And that lesson, simple yet profound, echoed far beyond the walls of Celso Ramirez's manor, touching hearts and transforming lives across the country. Clara had become more than a caregiver. She had become a symbol of hope for all those who believe that goodness, in the end, always triumphs over cruelty, and that human dignity is the most precious asset we possess.